Is it working? Actually, I can just speak like this because there's a mic. Okay, first of all, I want to thank you, the organizers, Eric and Jean-Pierre, for putting together this wonderful conference. Today, my topic is why identity, not inequality, the political activism of precarious youth in post-Hanover Hong Kong. So I will still stick to the topic of identity, but I want to shed light on the issue of inequality and also youth, since youth is such an important part of the political activism that we saw in the previous years. First of all, I want to apologize that this presentation is actually a bit long, so I'll try to rush through. There are 30 slides in this. I try to cut it short, but let me try to get through it in 20 minutes. It's a challenge. So the research problem that I'm facing, there are two realities today. The first reality that we know that post-Hanover Hong Kong has witnessed an intense cycle of popular protests, which has been highlighted in many of the presentations that we saw in yesterday and today. But we haven't pointed out enough that youth, in fact, played a very important role, if not indispensable role in the whole process. Although this is not a unique phenomenon just in Hong Kong, we saw this phenomenon in the entire world, that youth has been an important part of political activism elsewhere. The second reality is that I want to point out that the life course of Hong Kong's youth are actually increasingly subject to the impact of economic precarity. So I will talk about the concept of precarity in my presentation, meaning that the life course of youth are becoming increasingly unstable, and they're facing downward income and also decreasing social mobility. So against these two realities, the question I'm asking is that why are the youth-led contention that are happening in the past 10 years, why are they increasingly framed as struggles for political identity, but less so as class-based protests against economic inequality and precarity? If inequality is something that has been plaguing Hong Kong for so long, if inequality is an important issue, which I'll show you that it actually is. My presentation will also be a little descriptive, so Sebastian is not an exception. So political sciences can also be can also be very descriptive, because it's a preliminary project, and I'm still looking for ways to prove the hypothesis here. But here in the presentation, I will highlight some trends. So first of all, I think needless for me to highlight that Hong Kong has been facing an increasing number of protests, and this is the figure from the police. Even from the official perspective, we can see that this rising number of protests in Hong Kong. We still haven't figured out why the number has jumped in 2016, almost double up. We're thinking whether maybe it's because of the counter movements, counter protests, but police normally wouldn't respond to that type of questions, even if we ask them. But here we can see that there's a trend of increasing protests. And we must also emphasize that many of the larger protests in the past 10 years are led by young people, or they involve a lot of young people. So this is the heritage preservation movement, and we also saw this in the anti-high-speed rail movement. And of course, we saw this picture, Joshua Wong, who was only 15 years old when he led the anti-national education movement. So youth is a very important part of this period of political activism. So here's a participant profile of the umbrella movement, which came from a survey that Edmund and I did during the umbrella movement. And you can see that more than 60% of the people involved at some point in the umbrella movement are actually under 30 years old. And if you also count the number, the 30 to 39, you find an even bigger number. 80%, more than 80% of them are under 40 years old. And same for those who were arrested in the fishbowl revolution in 2016, which the government would call this the Mong riot or the disturbance. If you look at the number of people who were arrested related to the Mong disturbance, I try to collect the data from the newspaper. You can see that 70% of those are under 30 years old. And a large majority of them lies in the age group between 18 and 24. So very youthful participant again. And an even more striking picture if we look at the occupation of those who were arrested during the Mong protests. We see the majority number of them are students and also service and sales workers. Yesterday Stan was talking about the expansion of retail industry in Hong Kong, and I think this echoes with this point. A lot of these youth who were arrested were employed in these industries. And also, of course, the very striking number when we look at people who are unemployed. But in fact, if you talk to those protesters, they will tell you that they actually have a job, but it's a freelance job. But the government would categorize them as unemployed people. So we know a lot already about the political rationale for political activism in Hong Kong, and I don't want to go too much into that. We know about the institutional defects of the hybrid political system, the so-called disarticulation between different branches of government. We know about government-business collusion in this form called eclectic corporatism, increasing political intervention, and of course the emergence of new actors and new repertoires in the past few years. But we don't know a lot about how economic grievance are driving political activism, driving youth activism. There have been many quantitative studies about youth, and I try to look into those studies, but actually very few of them investigate the relationship between their economic status and their protest behavior, their dissent behavior. We still don't know the relationship, whether there is one. And what's more interesting is that when you interview the activists, they like to downplay the fact that economic grievance is a motivating factor for them. Because by doing so, they fear that it might obfuscate their demand for democracy. They will tell you that democracy is a real thing. Inequality is not what I'm fighting against. Okay, so it's very hard to get down to how economic grievance is actually playing a role. But I think more importantly for researchers, economic grievance in Hong Kong is not that easily displayed or shown or researched. I think one of the reasons is that in Hong Kong we actually have a relatively low youth unemployment. So you see the figure here, this is to break down into different age groups. Although you see a relatively higher unemployment rate for people aged between 15 and 19, but that's quite normal for such a young age. But if you look at 20 to 29, actually it's around 5%. It didn't go up quite a lot. And if you compare this figure with other countries, you can see Hong Kong has one of the lowest youth unemployment figure when compared to a lot of countries. It's slightly higher than Singapore and Japan, but much lower than the European countries. Okay? If you look at the European countries' average, it's around 22%, and Hong Kong is only 7%. Okay? So this is nothing when compared to the European figures. However, when you look into the data, when you look into the income data, for example, this is some data extracted from Professor Stephen Chew's article, which shows the median income between 2001 and 2011. So you can see that the overall income, which is highlighted in red, is declining from 11,000 Hong Kong dollars to 10,000 Hong Kong dollars. And if you compare this to the population average, you can see that income ratio has also declined from 0.91 to 0.83, which means that the youth are doing worse off than the population in general. Okay? And you also see a downward mobility in terms of the employment. I think this also echoes with Stan's point yesterday, that there's been an increase of the number of people working in the service and sales industry, sales workers, and also as clerical support workers. You can see that there's an increase in those proportion of people employed in those jobs in different education level. Okay, so if you look at the people who have a degree or above, more of them are working as clerical support workers rather than professionals, and more of them are working as sales and service and sales workers, which are, objectively speaking, more low paid than if you're a manager or you're a professional. Okay, and at the same time, as we all know, how living cost has been spiraling up in Hong Kong. This is, you can see that this is the housing price. I don't think I need to go a lot into that, but the figure is quite horrifying. The median, here it shows the median multiple of pre-tax household income, which means that it now takes 19 years for you to buy an apartment if you save your median income and don't spend a single dime of it. Okay, it's a real horrifying figure that tops the entire world. So for the youth, it's unimaginable. So that is why I try to categorize Hong Kong as a type of precarious labor. I understand that the standard definition of precarious labor is defined as labor that faces short-term, insecure, flexible, disposable employment situation, which is not really the case in Hong Kong, because people have a full-time job. But I sort of lean towards Ching Kwan Lee's definition, who defines precarity is more as a relational struggle which varies context by context, rather than like a thing like property. It should be considered within a specific culture or context. So in Hong Kong, we don't have terms like needs or fritas, which they characterize youth in Japan or Britain. But I think Hong Kong youth, in a broad sense, can be seen as a kind of precarious youth because, first of all, they face uncertainty towards attaining their life goals. And secondly, they also have a marginalized role in the economic and political system, which makes them difficult to reverse or improve their situation. And as we all know, precarity has been a very important field of activism on a global level. We have, since the 1990s, the anti-globalization protests, since Seattle against the WTO, and then in the 2000s, we have the global Occupy protests, which adopted a very strong inequality frame, as evidenced by the slogan, "We are the 99%. So inequality has been, through this anti-precarity movement, became what social movement scholars called a master frame. So a master frame is a generic type of collective action frame that is wider in scope and have more influence than the run-of-the-mill social movement frames that are more particular to issues. So inequality frame is like the mother frames or all frames that influence those smaller frames. But in Hong Kong, what is interesting is that inequality issues gained salience after 2003, but gradually gave way to a more identity-based frame. So I try to break down Hong Kong social movement in 3 periods. The first period is after 2003 until 2010. And in this period, we saw protests that are emerging and they're concerned with inequality and redistributive issues. And the main theme that are common to these protests is that they're against neoliberalism, against government business collusion, against crony capitalism. The second phase is a more transitional phase between 2011 and 2013, where you see the attention shifting to identity politics. In this period, so inequality protests are still occurring, but the traction is certainly slowing down, which I will show you in a minute. And in the third phase, 2014 to 2016, not a lot of protests, but you have really large ones, like the umbrella or the fishbowl revolution, where you see identity politics came to the surface, rose to permanence. So here I want to sketch this trend of this changing trend, but I'm not saying that in the first period there's nothing about identity. I agree with Sebastian that those are also very important in redefining Hong Kong's identity. But what I'm saying here is that the emphasis is different. The emphasis in the first phase of protest is more about the inequality issues deep down, but later it's more about the inequality issue, the identity issue. So the question that I'm asking is, why did the master frame undergo a shift in Hong Kong? So what I'm trying to do is to do an eventful analysis through different cycles of protests, and I see the frame shift as a contested process. It doesn't occur naturally. So it occurred because the actors contested the frame in each of the protests. So two hypotheses here. The first one is that I believe that the inequality frame is in fact fundamentally constrained by our economic system here in Hong Kong, which is capitalism. It's very hard for activists to frame their protests as anti-capitalist, like in the Occupy protests. I think this kind of limits the frame resonance, and that's also the scale of mobilization, of mass mobilization. So you see in the first phase of protests, the size is not that big, okay, compared to the later phase of the protests. The second argument, I think this echoes with Malty's point, is that I think the identity frame is more adept in attributing blame to specific targets and galvanizing emotions of the people. It's better at pointing fingers at specific culprits to explain the problems and how we're going to solve this. Okay, so these are the two hypotheses. And I don't want to go too much about master frame. We know that it's an interpretive schema that helps to accentuate injustice, make diagnostic and prognostic attributions, and also articulate experience of the protesters. And here what I'm arguing is that I think identity has done a better job, retrospectively speaking. Back in when I was joining the first phase of the movement, I thought, oh, this is actually resonating with my experience. But yeah, the political scientists like to see things in a retrospective perspective. Okay, so let's start with the first phase of protests between 2003 and 2010, which we saw the emergence of youth-led activism against the local neoliberal and corporatist order. So I think, let's not forget, because Sebastian talked a lot about the heritage preservation movement, but the roots of this movement is actually this anti-WTO protest in 2005, and which took place in Hong Kong. And at that time, actually, Hong Kong was in an economic recovery, because 2003 was Hong Kong hit a rock bottom of economic, because of SARS, it was doing very badly. So that aroused people's interest in grassroots issues in Hong Kong, and that explained why some activists joined an anti-WTO protest which had nothing to do with Hong Kong, and they supported Korean farmers on the streets. And through this protest, they learned the new frames and protest tactics, which we saw that they apply in the heritage preservation movements, and where they promote the notion of collective memory, public space, but more importantly, against the corporate logic of urban redevelopment. And the same group of activists started the anti-express railway movement in 2010, which is, as we all know, a protest against a very expensive high-speed rail connecting China and Hong Kong. And in this protest, it targeted against government business hegemony and also economic integration with China. So we can see throughout these protests, although it is not directly about wealth inequality, okay, it's not directly about redistribution, but underneath, it is trying to challenge the neoliberal and corporatist political order that entrench these kind of economic inequalities. Many new concepts were generated in this period, such as collective memory, public spaces, but I argue that most importantly, the core here is real estate hegemony and government business collusion. It's about, it's the political economy that gives rise to the problems in Hong Kong. But these protests, as we all know, they are, first of all, they're very limited. First of all, because of they're organized by a small group of committed activists, and also they remain at relatively low scale, small scale. Participants are mostly middle class, and they espouse post-material values rather than seeing themselves as the victims of a class exploitation. So while the protest was about inequality, but people who support it may not necessarily be the underclass or the grassroots. There are post-material, there's a very strong sense of post-material values in all these. And the second phase, we saw the rise of identity-based protests. First of all, starting with the anti-DNG protests in 2011, which is a protest against DNG's, one of the security guard tried to stop a Hong Kong person from taking pictures of DNG and telling him that, or her, that only Chinese people, only mainland Chinese are allowed to take the pictures. That was the rumor, so we didn't know actually what happened. But in any case, this aroused anger, emotions against the influx of Chinese tourists. Even though Chinese tourists has been increasing from 2003 onwards, but only until then were the anger exploded. The anger only exploded at that very point. And this kind of anti-China or anti-Chinese tourist emotion kind of continued. And you saw this anti-national education movement, which was sparked by the introduction of the patriotic curriculum, and with people protesting against what they saw as the attempt by China to introduce patriotic brainwashing on Hong Kong students. So you can see that in these two protests, there is a shift, increasing shift towards identity-based issues. Although you might argue that inequality is still very important, it's still an important mobilizing frame, but at the same time you see a diminishing resonance. So first of all, you have the Occupy Central protest under HSBC, which is different from the one from the real Occupy Central protest, the umbrella movement. And this was the one that is inspired by the global Occupy protest. But it remained extremely small, extremely contained. And when the court bailiff cleared the protest, actually not a lot of people went there to support it. And you have the dock workers strike in 2013. It was a very long, much bigger labor strike. And it also received unprecedented media attention, supported by student organizations. But the societal, but it didn't diffuse into a larger labor protest, or it didn't became a protest that is, concerned about labor conditions in Hong Kong. And then finally, in the final phase, you saw identity frame gaining prominence in the umbrella movement. And of course, we know that the umbrella movement was about universal suffrage in order to fend off China's influence. And you saw a very important slogan in the umbrella movement, which is to determine our own destiny. So very, very identity based. And you saw in a lot of the posters, even in German, emphasizing that we are Hong Konger, and I think this is a full display of identity-based protest. But what I want to focus, I don't have time to go a lot into the Mong Kok protest, but I want to draw your attention to, I think Mong Kok protest, basically it epitomized the clash between the inequality frame and the identity frame. And the identity frame eventually it gained prominence. It kind of triumphed over the inequality frame. So inequality frame. So the Mong protest was one of the protest camp during the umbrella movement. It's a working class neighborhood, and it drew diverse social groups. So that is shown in the statistics. We saw a higher number of the lower class participating in the protest. And we would naturally expect that this protest, or the Mong-based protest, will be more about inequality rather than identity, right? But indeed, yeah, that was a part of the theme that we saw in the Mong protest. We saw a sense of communitarianism and concern about social justice, livelihood issues in Mong. However, this is overshadowed by the conflicts with the police and counter-protesters in Mong, and which made Mong a symbol of militant resistance to fend off the aggressive mafia state that are seeking to wipe out local interests and identity. And I had this interview with one of the observer during the Mong protest, who recount that after the protesters reclaimed one of the streets from the police, they were shouting Hong Konger very loud, repeatedly, when they were trying to push that metal barrier on the ground, and they were shouting. So you can see very, very strong sense of identity developed out from Mong, rather than about inequality here. And of course, in Mong is basically the spotlight of the umbrella movement, where the leftist pricks, basically people who support, leaning towards supporting the grassroots issues, they were being accused of carnivalizing the protests by playing ping pongs or eating hot pots inside Mong. They were surrounded by angry localists and saying that you shouldn't have fun when we are trying to fend off the communists. You should act more militant rather than just relaxing out here. And if you read this book is published by Passion Times, and I think it basically sums up the localist rhetoric of how they see Mong protests. So they said that in Mong, protesters kept on resisting against the enemies, and this allowed localist consciousness to gradually take over the protest camp. From now on, localist consciousness will be unstoppable. So you can see in this framing, basically the inequality issues are swept under the carpet. They did not appear as the main issues here. And the identity frame became even more prominent in the fishbowl revolution, which was sparked by the crackdown on unlicensed street hawkers during the Chinese New Year. And when we mention street hawkers, we will think about Arab Spring in Tunisia. The death of a street hawker also initiated a protest, and a lot of unemployed youth took to the streets. So we would expect that it would be similar to what happened, or the issues that motivated the Arab Spring. But this is actually not what the case in the fishbowl revolution. The protesters, when I try to interview them, they would tell me that the reason why they supported the fishbowl revolution, or the reason why they were there, is not because of inequality. It's not because that they're very sympathetic with the hawkers. It's because they want to protect this local way of life, this culture. They think that hawkers is a culture of Hong Kong, rather than about grassroots issues. So I got this, I'm still trying to do the interview, but one of the interviewers really told me that he support the hawkers because he wants to protect Hong Kong's identity, because it's a local culture, and it's not because they are the grassroots, they are the underclass. Actually, this is Andy Chan as well, another localist leader, and he told me that he joined politics because he loves his identity as a Hong Konger, and he doesn't see capitalism as a threat or as an enemy. And in his opinion, capitalism is a core value of Hong Kong, and why it became successful. So you can see that the inequality issues that characterized the first phase of protest have really faded out and replaced by
Give you a bit more time.
Thank you.